We now call the Prime Minister.
Okay, so just before I start, guten Abend, liebe Damen und Herren, Debattierer und Richter. I would like to thank you all for great competition, and particularly, I'm particularly grateful to be sharing this final with such great debaters, and more importantly, such great friends. Glasgow University Union tells you that this debate is about the cult of heroism of the soldier. We think this is one of the key distinctions that feeds into that cult, and we think that cult has been particularly damaging in a number of ways. We think the hero complex would be harmful to the military itself. We think it detracts from serious criticism of the military. We think the civilian-soldier distinction leads to poor policy decisions, and we think finally toxic masculinity is harming society, all things we're bringing you in opening government. So we think that the distinction here is whether or not soldiers are just another class of combatant, or are in fact seen as some kind of special case, where they are treated separately, they're treated as differently, the norms that adhere to them are not the norms that apply to civilians. We think that's harmful. To some extent, this is not a debate about practical reality. This is a debate where we don't have to show whether or not we'll be able to change people's minds about achieving this norm. This is about whether the world in which this distinction did not exist would be a better or a worse one. We think that we can show you that it would be manifestly a worse one in a large number of ways. We think this is also not necessarily a debate about the political capital for things like, body armor and things like veterans pay. One, because we think the incentives to demand those things to the point of soldiers and the capacity to lobby does not change on either side of the debate. But second, because we think in some ways the cult of masculinity that we're talking about in some ways detracts from that, because people think they don't need body armor to go into dangerous things and they're willing to take on more absurd risks. First, why do we think the hero complex has been harmful to the military? Any questions to the definition? Great, cool. So we think, one, it encourages people to make first decisions during combat. That means risking their lives, risking their combat's lives, their fellow combatants' lives, in order to be able to take on risks, in order to demonstrate their heroism. We think this is obviously detrimental in terms of the comparative being what would happen if soldiers were just approaching things on a purely logical basis. But second, though, we think also heroism entails villainism, right? We think that a point where people are told, you are the heroes, it implies that the other people are the villains. We think this is one of the reasons you got such problematic behavior within the scope of Vietnam, within the scope of the Iraqi occupation, because soldiers necessarily saw the occupied civilians that they were treating as antagonistic to them. They saw themselves as the heroes, which meant anyone who was not supporting them must necessarily be the villains. We think this villainization has obviously been harmful in terms of the military's relation to the people under its control. We think it also uses a coercive tool to manipulate vulnerable poor people into the armed forces. We think an 8-year-old with a trite is not able to resist the pull of the army using the cult of the hero in order to try and induce him into the military. We think, one, this is a clear violation of the autonomy of the individual, because we think this is an illegitimate means of coercing someone into making a decision to risk their lives. But second and foremost, we think those people tend to be poor soldiers. They haven't necessarily assessed the risk before going into the military, and are therefore unprepared for the reality within the combat zone. Alex. Oh, okay, fine. Help me.
Okay, these people's lives haven't been taken, they're specifically given. Why do you think that not treating them as heroes is relevant?
Because we think that in some ways all people who die within combat zones should be treated to a certain basic level of respect, a certain basic level of dignity. We don't see why these people should be singled out in a particular way, because even though they have legitimately volunteered their services to our country, we think nonetheless, like those people who are the victims within war generally are all equally regrettable. Second, one of the things that attracts some serious criticism of the military. So we think, one, it means that generals necessarily now have more lobbying power. You can see this, for example, in the way that General Petraeus was able to attempt to overrule Barack Obama's democratically elected power in order to try and force his decision as far as what should be done as far as the Afghan withdrawal. Second, though, we think if you grow up in a world where soldiers are always presented as heroes, it means you are much more likely to listen to government propaganda with regard to, say, what it might be the case that your army is doing in certain territory that might be under your control, whether or not that's legal under the Fourth Geneva Convention. Third, we think it's more likely that you're willing to make excuses for soldiers' behaviours when such negative behaviours are reported. The practical consequence of this is there's going to be more Abu Ghraibs, because people think the soldiers can necessarily be trusted to have absolute control over vulnerable civilians, even if it's not true. And I second think that it means you won't notice problems like James Foley until they spark, until something actually happens, and it means that prior criticism is less likely to happen. Third, we think the distinction between the deaths of civilians and soldiers means you make worse policy decisions. We think in some ways this is analogous to the reporting on migrant families in the British press that says, well, how many British holidaymakers' holidays were disrupted? We think the problem with always assessing combat in terms of the number of your soldiers that were killed means you don't necessarily assess the underlying merits of those issues. We think, as I said in response to the point of information, all lives matter, all lives matter equally. We think that mothers grieve their children whether or not they are soldiers or whether or not civilians in a combat zone. We think, therefore, that the practical consequence of having this distinction in policy-making terms is twofold. One, you get the body bag calculus. It means that it deters us from acting in situations where we think that the number number of soldiers who are killed is too high, we think that's unacceptable at the point where that means, one, either we don't intervene in a large number of cases, or second, it means that the calculus of intervention is likely to be determined by things like whether or not we're able to gain revenue from doing so, whether or not the benefits to, say, Halliburton or Bechtel outweigh the costs in terms of the number of soldiers that are killed. We think that is not the calculus upon which intervention decisions should be made. The ultimate calculus should be how many lives can be saved by doing this. We think, therefore, the consequence of having this distinction in place means that you don't get intervention in places like Syria, in places where we could actually do genuine benefit for people who would otherwise be killed, and we think those lives matter just as much as our own. Fourth, we think that it means you get things like perverse incentives to respond to terrorist actions taken specifically against soldiers. You saw this, for example, in the release of Gilad Shalit, where he was released in response to 1,024 Hamas operatives. The number of people those Hamas operatives can kill as a result of being released is much, much higher than the risk to that one particular individual. But because of the cult of the soldier being driven through the media narrative about Gilad Shalit's capture, the Israeli government was in no position to be able to meaningfully negotiate in terms of the overall benefit for the Israeli population. I've already taken you. Closing, do you want POI?
All right.
All right. So fourth, we think toxic masculinity is ruining society. We think the practical consequences of a cult of hero on the part of the soldier is that bleeds into other aspects of the way in which we value things, and we value things in society generally. We don't want to live in a world where Ariel Sharon is electable as a prime minister primarily because of his record as a soldier, because people demand that of people who are elected official. Dan Gosesby, I love you, Dan. Second, we also think that it means in the USA, having served in Vietnam becomes a test to office, and people can criticize John Kerry not on his merits as a politician, but on the extent to which he may or may not have earned his Purple Heart, and people can criticize those who did not serve in the armed forces for failing their country in some abstract way. We don't think they failed their country. Secondly, we think also children are very likely to look up to soldiers. They're very likely to see the kind of solutions that soldiers necessarily need to use to solve problems, which say, masculine, militaristic ways, use of force, the use of violence as practical means to solve their problems. We don't think those are the best way to solve problems. We think, obviously, the normative effect, ultimately, of having this as being spread throughout society as the way to solve problems means that people are less likely to seek out peaceful solutions, both on a local scale, with regards to their own lives, and on a global scale. Finally, we think that a further cult of masculinity, at the point where necessarily the cult of the soldier is heteronormative and highly masculinized, means that it shuts out other marginalized groups who do not necessarily fit into this calculus. We mean people like LGBT individuals. We mean people that just aren't particularly masculine, right? I'm not a particularly masculine person. I think we're ultimately harmed by a cult, by a society in which a certain group of people are singled out as special individuals to be worthy of particular praise, when we don't think necessarily that is entirely meted by the sacrifice they make to us. So I'd like to end by saying I would like to thank you all for allowing me to debate with you, possibly exceeding my welcome, and for arguably the last time, possibly, I'm very proud on behalf of GEU to propose.
We thank the Speaker for his speech and are delighted to call upon the Leader of the Opposition.
$180. We want to be very clear. Soldiers are never victims of crimes that happen in a war zone. Soldiers did not have their lives taken, they gave their lives specifically. That is what creates a separation between them and civilian deaths, which is the comparison in this debate, not them and other operatives, as Duncan wanted to talk about. We tell you specifically that this is a debate about political capital, unlike what first propositions say, because the state has an ability to change the way that others see that army. So, for example, the United States government is very good at it, engaging with patriotism within its country through making people in their schools sing the national anthem in the morning, through encouraging people to enter that, through having 4th of July celebrations that specifically celebrate the military and Veterans Day. in all that way, you do shape political capital, you do shape the way that society sees that army, so that is very important in this debate. Two things in this speech. First of all, we're going to talk about how individually it is necessary to respect that sacrifice that soldiers specifically have given over and above what everyone else has done, and secondly, we're going to talk about how this changes individual army mechanisms and how it makes those armies, no thank you, better compared to what we get from proposition. First of all, though, 4 pieces of rebuttal, because we get told by Duncan that this will create worse soldiers when we give them this hero status. First of all, the comparison is with citizens. So they tell us that they do bad things to Arabs, for example, because they see them as being different. That is not the comparison that you make as a soldier within that army. You make that comparison to all of the other people at home that you are trying to protect. That is the hero status you are given. Insofar as pretty much every American thinks they're better than someone from the Middle East. That's a problem that Prop have to deal with. Anyway, secondly, let's talk about abuses within the army, because they tell us that we just wash over them, we pretend they don't exist. 3 responses to this. First of all, we give a higher standard to people that we believe are better than us because they've given themselves in a courageous way. So we expect more from soldiers than urinating on people, for example, no thank you. That's why there was such outrage when that incident occurred in Afghanistan. It's why those soldiers were held to a higher standard. Secondly, we would also say So thirdly, then let's talk about hostage situations, which they say that other people can get leverage when we overvalue our own soldiers. We say, first of all, most governments also value their own citizens hugely. So we see most governments in Europe giving away huge amounts of ransom to groups like ISIS when civilians are taken, just because the American government, just because the Israeli government, as they use, don't follow those same tactics, doesn't mean that governments don't value citizens' lives as well. So that's not the comparison in this debate. Let's look firstly at why it's necessary to respect individual soldiers' lives, because we recognise that joining the army is one of the most demanding jobs that someone can do. First of all, because of the training that goes into that, whether or not you're ever deployed. Secondly, because of the things that you see on a battlefield that change you, because of the danger that you face on that battlefield. And finally, because of what happens after you come home, because that never leaves you, because once a soldier, always a soldier. We therefore think you always deserve the respect of having been that soldier. The reason that that's important is because you can't hold up, for example, injured vets as being heroes without also holding up people who have died, so you don't get to make that distinction on proposition. The reason that is important is because all that you have left, having come back from that otherworldly situation and trying to integrate back into society, is the dignity and respect that we give you from a societal point of view, because without that you're just another individual who has very little money, probably has very little education and few other opportunities, no thank you, in life. They tell us though as well that the hero complex causes a huge amount of problems on the battlefield in the way in which soldiers act. We think that is untrue, for one simple reason, because soldiers have to act as heroes in order to do some of the things that soldiers have to do. Sometimes it is necessary for someone to jump on a grenade, knowing that that will kill them, knowing that they will never see their family again, because it will save the rest of their platoon, because the rest of their platoon will go on to complete that mission. Only a hero could do that. Only someone who believes that they are willing to sacrifice their own body and their own lives to achieve that would do that. No ordinary civilian would do that. That's why they didn't join the army. The reason that all of that is important, and this is why political capital is important, is because when other people see that that is the sacrifice that you made, they are more likely to give you funding for PTSD treatment. They are more likely to give you funding for physical injuries that you sustained in the battlefield, and they are more likely to find it completely repulsive, no thank you, and unacceptable when a vet is left homeless because of the lack of educational opportunities that they had because they were away fighting in Iraq and in Afghanistan. That means in 2 ways. First of all, because we value that life that they gave in servitude, and secondly, because that government can specifically change the way that we view soldiers, and we view those soldiers who also come home. We think they are definitely deserving of that respect. No thank you. So let's look how this changes armies and how they operate internally. First of all, because the most important part of an army is when they are deployed in a battle zone, when they are deployed to war. We think currently the public is very, very slow to get behind certain things like interventions in Syria, as is mentioned by First Proposition, because of the fact that they realise that those deaths are hugely valuable to society. If they want to tell us that we should be intervening everywhere and probably doing a bad job like we did in Iraq and like we did in Afghanistan, Chris is free to spend his speech trying to justify that. It'll take a while. No thank you. We tell you that actually that caution is probably pretty good, because we shouldn't be interfering in other people's business for a start in that way, but secondly because that will inevitably lead to more of those deaths. But secondly as well, we also think, actually before I get to the second half of this point, I will take closing.
This is not a debate about the glorification of bravery. This is a debate about specifically using the dead in order to do so. Can you please start to refer to that?
No, it's about doing it all, because as I explained, you can't glorify those who are still alive without also glorifying those who are dead. In fact, those who are dead probably made more of a sacrifice, so in anything, you probably give them more credence on our side of the house. So that is unfortunately the comparison in this debate. Secondly, though, let's look at hiring practices within armies, because we recognise, and it is mentioned by First Prop, that sometimes those practices can be coercive. Ultimately, though, what we do when we put the hero tag on soldiers is we say, this is not just any other job. The things that you will be expected to go through, the things that you will see, will literally change you forever. That's why we put you up so high. Everyone who operates within an army structure is very clear on the sacrifices that they will be expected to make. We want people to be sure of what those sacrifices are. When it is literally just the same pay between doing that or working a 9-to-5 job somewhere else in your community, we think people are more inclined to fall into that without realizing the full consequences of their decision. When it is made clear to them that you will be a hero because the courage it takes to make these sacrifices, here's other people who have made those sacrifices, then they understand that more clearly. We think we have fewer people slipping into the army who otherwise wouldn't be there. Look, ultimately, these individuals deserve respect because they are not victims. They are not the same as anyone else who died in a tragedy or died in an accident. They specifically went there knowing very well that this could happen. Any of that by itself is unacceptable, but together it beats this proposition we're proud to oppose.
We thank the Speaker very much for his speech and are delighted to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
A second. Duncan, can I borrow your timer? From DPM for Glasgow, I'm going to build a case around subtle distortions that a hero complex makes to a variety of decision-making processes. Some impacts are huge, i.e. increased amount of death on their side of the house as opposed to ours. Some are more marginal shifts in the right direction. We still think these are clear concrete gains and all benefits from Gov. Couple of responses, first of all, though. What we hear is a characterisation that we should consider that soldiers gave their lives as opposed to portray them as victims or that they lost their lives. We think this is kind of precisely our point. We think on opposition, it is far easier to justify the death of a soldier when you portray it as they gave their life, they volunteered, they agreed to it. We think it's preferable to paint this as regrettable, not par for the course and something that just happens. We think this pushes you in the direction of attempting to avoid the deaths of soldiers on our side of the house. At best, right at the start of the speech, we think the underlying point might be a distinguishment between combatants from civilians. But fortunately, on our side of the house, we do still have a Geneva Convention and rules of war, and we're pretty confident in identifying the fact that soldiers are the ones shooting back and the civilians are the ones that aren't. We think that distinction clearly still stands no matter what approach you take to this. The second point to respond to relates to veterans. Now, we fully appreciate that veterans need assistance on both sides of the house, but we think still on our side of the house you have a moral or a tortious duty towards your injured soldiers. Recognise these are people who have been actively harmed and their future capacity has been reduced in the course of their job. Therefore, you have that duty to them. You don't need to call someone a hero to provide this. If you call them a victim, which is the comparative that they set up, then you still have political capital to protect victims if you've inflicted that suffering on them. So let's be clear about the characterisation that we're having, first of all. What we get is a characterisation of all soldiers as heroes. So what does this look like? You're painting the death of a soldier as glorious and noble, and you're romanticising that death, thereby demeaning the harm that has caused. We think this allows you to say things like, sure, someone has died, but it was fine because he or she was a hero. We think the reality is that war is disgusting, unpleasant and undignified. We think death is a terrible harm that should not be demeaned. The consequence is that all actors fear death less. The soldiers fear death less, and the wider public, when they think about soldiers, fear death less. We think this affects the way that all soldiers view themselves and the ways that they are viewed. Because necessarily, if you're a hero when you die, then presumably you're still a hero, or expected to act like a hero during the course of your duties. So this has a few impacts and a few distortions. First of all, on recruitment. We think becoming a hero is used as a coercive recruitment tool to push people into joining the army when otherwise they wouldn't. There are very few, and in many countries no, alternative occupations with a greater risk of death. It requires a very specific characteristics, both physical and mental, and as opposition accept, is an incredibly demanding job. Therefore, we think it's incredibly important that prospective recruits ask themselves if they have all of these characteristics, that they ask themselves, like, does this justify the risk of harm? Have they fully assessed this? We think that, the depiction of soldiers as a hero inhibits your ability to do that. It distorts in favour of becoming a hero, of becoming a soldier, sorry. The consequence of this is real human damage to all the people who identify becoming as a soldier as the correct career path for them when it shouldn't have been. Second impact, the effect that this has on soldiers. First of all, we told you that battle decisions become much worse. You're expected to act like the hero characterization. This is not a good thing. This means soldiers putting themselves at greater risk when you get more of the biggest harm in this debate, i.e. the death of your soldiers. We think even Paul's own best case example proves this. Like, the examples we're talking about are like lost causes where you feel like you have to do something that can only really result in your death, but you're still trying to be a hero. His best example is a soldier jumping on a grenade to save lots of people. But if the only thing making you do that is the depiction of your death as heroism, then you have been coerced to commit suicide on the opposition side of the House. We think that is morally horrendous. We think another impact for soldiers happens after the conflict finishes. We have more massive individual harms to soldiers, at the point at which a huge percentage of soldiers suffer psychological damage. You need awareness of this issue, and you need people to be willing to come forward and seek help when they have this issue. But soldiers don't do this because they're supposed to act like heroes. They're supposed to act in the hyper-masculine way that Duncan talks about and goes completely unresponded to. The consequence is that if they have psychological damage, they might not even know, and even if they do know, they don't come forward. And even if they do come forward, the services aren't there because people don't associate soldiers with needing these sorts of things, because that's not the way that heroes behave. Heroes don't suffer mental health damage. I'll take it.
Okay, you tell us that all death is disgusting, yet Duncan wants more interventions. Which view is wrong?
I'm specifically coming on to interventions. Okay, so on political decisions, right, we think what we want in relation to the types of wars that we go into is an accurate calculus as to whether or not this is the war that you should be in. We think in most cases this means you should not be going to war. We think we still get the good ones on our side of the House. Let's unpack this. So, first of all, we think the decision in relation to military force is a trade-off between whatever benefit you have and the risk of death. We think a heroism narrative distorts in favour of war. We think you mitigate the harm that comes with war by depicting soldiers as heroes and their deaths as heroic. We think self-defence wars are always going to continue to happen because you still win that trade-off. But we think this policy might be the make or break between entering into ideological wars or wars of self-interest. We think, like, on the balance, we shift people away from entering into wars that we prefer objectively for them to not enter into. We think, at the very least, we deliver an accurate balancing act which isn't distorted by an incomplete depiction of what being a soldier actually is. We think the consequence is net fewer wars, which we think is clearly a benefit. Like, wars are monumentally harmful, but we still think we get all the good wars that you want on their side of the House. In addition to this, as Duncan tells you, you still get vilification of the enemy on your side of the House because it's your soldiers that are the heroes, not the other soldiers. This creates a greater propensity towards committing things like war crimes because you value some lives over others. If your soldiers are the heroes, nobody else is. So if you have to kill more civilians to protect your heroes, if you have to kill more enemies or do worse things to your enemies to protect your heroes, then we think this makes conflicts much worse. We think it probably makes conflicts much longer as well, at the point at which both sides are portraying each other as the enemy. We think this entrenches divides as opposed to portraying something as just a simple act of war. Finally, we also told you that this makes criticising the military more difficult, because these political decisions have been made by people in power who have also presumably come through the ranks of the armies and presumably still carry with them the narrative of a hero. So to criticise a political decision made in relation to the military is to criticise a hero. People are not willing to do that. We think that makes worse political decisions all round. So if you get a warmongering general who wants to go into wars that you might not want to go into, it's harder to criticise that because he's a hero, he knows best. Propose the motion.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister and are delighted to call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
To regret, to victimize, is to deny agency. That is so offensive because the thing that they did with their agency is to offer up their lives for you. We value them, not because they are macho, not because they can do lots of push-ups, not because of their top lad banter, because they made the ultimate sacrifice for us. Specifically, their deaths is why we owe them a duty that is insulted by this proposition. First point, why you owe it to them. Second, how this changes armies. Before I get into it, some points of rebuttal. Like, first off, we're told that we will not respect these people anymore unless we victimize them. Note that you owe a specific duty when they gave themselves to you. It is not just that you feel sorry for this man, but you owe something or woman that he gave to you. Second, like in his own analysis, quote was, "It is easy because of your arguments to paint what happened as just regrettable." Putting that in the words of your motion might also make it easy to paint them as just regrettable and not allow the genuine impact of what they have sacrificed, not taken, gave to us to actually sink in. Second, they say the individuals will fear death less. Recognise that I don't think people will stop being afraid of death. I think that they will realise that what their decision was to accurately weigh that up and voluntarily take that fear upon themselves for us. But secondly, Paul told you that we need them to make that calculus. They literally need to be shot at and not lose rank. These are people who need to understand exactly what they have done and to function in an army. Finally, they say that heroism is specifically going to be an issue, no thank you, because it makes them macho and that impacts the rest of society. Notice that this is a heroism specifically built on their sacrifice. It is a nuance that is necessary in society that to some extent we lose, and it is entirely overshadowed by propositions, lad culture in a sexist world that does value action man and never thinks about his sacrifice, never thinks about that real hero, never thinks about what happens. Why do they deserve it? Just to factually lay that out, even if you are conscripted into an army, there is always an option in terms of abstaining from that, of volunteering in a hospital. Even if you are incredibly poor, there are lots of other jobs that you could have taken. These people, and we will not stand for anything left, have specifically made their sacrifice for us. They have chosen to put their lives on the line for what we need. It is insulting. Note that people will not care less if they are victims on proposition. The comparative is that they will care in the wrong way. They will pity these people instead of respecting what it was that they did for our lives. Why is that hurtful? First off, before individuals join, they think that people are going to be coerced or brainwashed into believing, no thank you, that the army is just awesome. Bear in mind that Paul told you that this provides the necessary information that it is not a happenstance if you die. It is not something that we don't expect. That is the sacrifice you make at the moment you set up, needs to be understood. We concede that that is not perfect on our side. Obviously, you're going to need to give information when people are volunteering for the army. That's what you should be doing, as a government. We also concede that the reason it's not perfect is because people probably can't accurately understand what it's like to be in a war zone and weigh that against anything else. That is the same for every incentive to ever join an army. It is something we're happy to stand over when we get the benefit of actually showing people what war is. Secondly, afterwards, they say that that people won't pity them, no thank you, because, big boys don't cry, heroes don't suffer from those. Note that it is helpful that armies can specifically construct what a hero means. A hero is the person who made that sacrifice, who was broken by the state, no thank you, for what you needed. They gave everything, and it is worth protecting them. Note that is the narrative given. That's why in places like America, they give so much aid to their soldiers and to the individuals individuals who come back from war. The difference on our side, and they could comparatively do that, the difference is that you are pitied, you are victimized when you feel like you are nothing and you feel like you are broken. They need at this moment more than anything else to be given opportunity, to be given respect, to be given value. That only happens when they are heroes. That's the comparative win in opposition. Second, why is this likely to impact how wars work? Closing.
Why do you believe that if I'm a POW, I am not longer considered as a soldier, but rather as a human being back again?
Sorry, just repeat the start.
Why do you believe that if I'm falling capture in a wartime, I'm considered as a human being again and not as a soldier?
Yes, the reason why, because you specifically made the choice to go to war that you're considered here, the sacrifices at the start, that was clear in terms of what Paul explained of how this changes the issues. Right, first off, they say this can't regulate armies. Armies regularly, helpfully regulate themselves. Like, it is martial law. It is not that, like, someone outside who has no right to challenge your heroism will be taking you to task. It is another hero, a general, further up than you. So it doesn't impact our ability to do that. Like, second, we point out that you can expect more. This is specifically relevant to the motion. The reason why I may not do something like urinate on a corpse is because other men died for this campaign. My brethren in the army who have already made sacrifices, who have died, are the reason it's so offensive. We think the places like America have a higher standard for their armies because their children are fighting there too, and they respect that because they are heroes who are giving their lives, and everyone in the army must necessarily tie to that. We think that it also makes governments more accountable. Governments have to owe something because they placed their lives in your hands. It was not taken again, it was placed, given. They say this gets a hero complex in society. Note that that's worse when you just heroize, when people think that macho is always necessarily pushed up, and that's better in society. But second, worse on their side. But second, we point out that when you specifically glamorize the sacrifice, you think you respect people in a far more nuanced way. Then they say people can't go to war. Look, the reality is that most people are, in status quo, incredibly cautious to go for war. We realize that there has to be a specific balance to that. Like, most people hate the idea of armies or intervention. First Prop are straight up lying when they think it's our solution to everybody in most European states. But what we need is to balance that accurately with still loving soldiers. You need to respect those people. That can only happen when they still look like heroes, even though the government atop isn't. It is only by providing a hero status, no thank you, to those individual soldiers that you can actually balance it. Like, that was the actual answer Paul wanted when he was asking you to clarify what is the reasonable balance step that necessarily has to happen. They say, no thank you, we've leverage because soldiers are look like heroes, and so we have to look after them. Note that, the reason that's wrong is the same reason why terrorists tend to target civilians, not soldiers. It is actively more shocking when we see civilians being harmed right now because we think that they were entirely innocent, because we think that they're victims. That has a massive power in society. We fully conceded that. We did say the comparative was not stopping caring about soldiers. But the problem is that you specifically insult soldiers when you treat them like that. These are not victims. These are not individuals who are powerless, who could not make any other decision. They are people who deserve your respect in terms of going into war and in terms of taking place. Look, they say then that it's a hero complex, and that's in some way coercion. It's not coercion if you literally deserved it. It is a recognition of what they do. They genuinely put their lives on the line every single day. Also, we would say that things like training are coercion in terms of making them react in a certain way. Obviously, that is necessary. But we don't think we're lying to them. We don't think they've been duped. We think that literally, at times, you need to put your life on the line, and we absolutely have a duty on our side of the house to respect that, to take that seriously, because we need them to function. Look, it's not for the last time by any stretch of the imagination, but we think we're right. Proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker very much for their speech, and to open the second half of the debate, we are delighted to call upon the Member of Government.
Ladies and gentlemen, most of the first house talked to us about perception of soldiers as heroes in general. We're going to talk specifically about the perception of dead soldiers as heroes, and we're going to explain why that specifically you do not have the right
to do. We agree with opening opposition that we have an obligation to the agency of soldiers. It is because of that obligation, that we would not have a right to use and nationalize their memory and their legacy. This is going to be my main point. Second of all, I'm going to talk to you about why we trap narratives and lead to longer, more sustained wars. Before that, a few points of rebuttal to what we heard from opening opposition. First of all, the premise of their case is that you need to glorify specifically dead soldiers in order for them to get the right treatment that they deserve. We dispute that on 4 levels. Firstly, we say you can present the living soldiers as heroes. We believe that is enough. Secondly, we believe that if they tell us that the army has ways of structuring narratives in this way, then it has the ability to structure neo-narratives which say that soldiers should be respected although they are not heroes, or to respect, for example, the soldier, not the soldier that died, but the soldier that did not abuse people in Abu Ghraib. We're saying these are much better narratives that we want to promote. Third of all, we say that you give soldiers rights because of things like 4th of July, Flag Day, all sorts of commemorations that you do for the contribution of the army to society. We don't say that necessitates the view as a hero specifically. Also, we say that the notion that death is an unfortunate does not equal pity. We do not understand why that is the case. We say, I can grieve for the loss of a leader, I can grieve for the loss of a parent, without saying he is a hero, and I do not have to say that I pity him for it. Second of all, they say, I need this in order to function on a battlefield, I need this in order to jump on the grenade. First of all, opening opposition, government already didn't point out that if the soldiers themselves do not actually feel like a hero, then they are likely to function less well in the battlefield. But moreover, we say usually the reason soldiers on the battlefield, when they jump on the grenade, don't think about what someone will say about me in a funeral back home. They think about their friends in the field. First of all, they think about second of all, they think about the training and discipline that they have already received. They do this automatically. We say that's not actually an issue in this debate. Let's talk about why it's illegitimate to nationalize these people's memory. Because we say that soldiers have obligations that don't apply to anybody else in society. They can be under very strong physical and emotional duress. They can actually be shot at legally. We say that's a very unique status. In light of that, we also give them very significant protections specifically to defend their agency and their humanity beside the function of a soldier, to allow them to be human beings. We say that the most important of those protections is the fact that once you are out of combat, you are no longer a combatant. Once you are no longer a functioning part of the army, you are no longer part and obliged to the state. How do we know this? Dan gives up in a POI about prisoners of war, where if I have fallen captive, I am no longer under the obligation and under any obligation to the state. Notice, every previous action that I've done as a soldier now is not relevant, even if I've done a crime during the time I was a soldier. As a prisoner of war, I cannot be tried for that crime, specifically because I am again a person. I return to be a person. I return to be an individual. Now we say a dead soldier obviously ceases to be a soldier. We don't think they'll dispute that part. We say obviously he's not functioning in combat. He returns to be an individual. He returns to be a person with agency. Now we say what remains of a person once he is dead? What remains of his agency? His legacy, his memory, the way he's remembered. We say this is crucially important to people individually. We know that because basically the fear of death is something that's a major driving force for people. So the notion that they leave something behind is something that defines their life in the present. We say therefore that it is illegitimate for the state to take that one thing that I have once I have no longer volition in order to give that away. It is not legitimate for the state to make national use of my own legacy, of my own memory. It is not legitimate specifically because of two things. Firstly, because being a hero, unlike just saying that it is unfortunate that I died, being a hero entails certain characteristics inherently with it. The notion that, for example, I am not self-serving, but served others. The fact that I am courageous. All these things may not necessarily apply to me. They may not necessarily be things I want to define myself on the basis of. However, this definition is forced upon me by the state. It is taken by the state in order to serve certain goals for other people. We say that's exactly nationalization that we do not allow to happen. Moreover, we say that that the soldier is basically, we say a soldier is a function, however, that entails with it the notion of bravery and of heroism. However, we have an obligation to these people to remember them as human beings, as agents, and the only way in which we can do that is to stop their treatment as heroes. Before I go on, I'll take opening.
Soldiers specifically give themselves to the nation. How do you create a coherent narrative that says I'm a hero to take a bullet, hero to be a soldier, but as soon as I die, that was just unfortunate?
Thank you. What we say is very simple. We tell you it is courageous and it is heroic to face danger. However, we say what we're talking about, specifically things like making my tombstone and making a parade about it, making ceremonies in order to glorify what sort of person I was, using my memory and my heroism in a national manner. We're saying this is something that's illegitimate. Moreover, let's talk quickly about why this leads to prolongation of wars through narratives. Because we say that when you treat specifically the dead as heroes, you enshrine them in the public sphere. You have commemorations, you have gravestones, you have big buildings of commemoration. What this leads to is, first of all, the enemy is first of all your own people seeing this war itself as something that is heroic, something that's glorified. Notice, most people don't know that much about most wars their country has participated in. We say that the likely scenario that if you see this only in public space related to the dead heroes, you're much more likely to perceive that war as something justified. Even if you're talking about, for example, Americans today perceiving the Vietnam War and seeing a commemoration of soldiers, they're much more likely to perceive it as something good and something positive if we glorify the soldiers that were there. Specifically people, after a while, who don't remember the sacrifice, who don't remember the price. So we say that is more likely to lead to more conflict. Moreover, the enemy side, which sees your own soldiers as villains, as the ones who hurt them, as the ones who invaded them, and now see you glorifying them. You see, they see that the state glorifies them and gives them respect and more than any other function in that state. We say that is especially pernicious because it traps both sides in conflict. We see an example of the Japanese temples for war criminals. We say this is exactly the sort of situations we want to avoid on our side of the house. For all these reasons, I'm proud to propose.
We thank the speaker very much for his speech. And to open the case for the closing opposition, we are delighted to call upon the member of opposition.
Ready? Alex and I are going to extend in two planks. We'll first of all tell you the impact this has on war, and critically not just what wars we go into, but what happens when we have entered those wars. Secondly, we're going to ask who are soldiers. Critically, they are the most disadvantaged, and we're going to explain why the rhetoric of heroism uniquely means we're more likely to give them the benefits that they deserve rather than cascade them out as the poor and disadvantaged and the regrettable loss of life, and we can leave it there. 4 points of rebuttal. Firstly, to closing government. Closing government, I think, was a little bit weird. So, opening government said that we don't want to valorize soldiers at all. Closing government said it was fine if we do it to people who are alive. The end said the real problem with the extension was that it's not fair for a dead soldier for us to valorize you and heroize you after you've died because we're co-opting your legacy. I think the prisoner of war analogy was disanalogous. Why? Because when you're a prisoner of war, if you're then returned back to your army, you can then be tried. You're not just ended being a soldier entirely. The argument was that, well, when you've dead, you return to a person with agency. No, you're dead. You don't have any agency, right? They then said, but no, it's not fair to co-opt the legacy left behind. Look, you're still co-opting their legacy, right? You're not just saying nothing about them. You're saying that it's regrettable loss of life, right? It's still some form of narrative, right? I actually think that's likely to be far worse. Why? Because you're not saying it as positive. You're leaving it open to the ravages of the press and say there's no counter-narrative. You make it more easy to say you deserved it or you're on a war that was illegal or that's incredibly damaging. But critically, we think that even if you don't deserve to co-opt your legacy, changing it and say that soldiers were heroes and died for a cause is useful because we have an obligation to all the other soldiers, right? And so do you. You accidentally were the one who got shot, not the other soldier. You should have an obligation to them. So we can say that this means we're more likely to treat soldiers better on balance. We're happy to say that. The second half of their extension, and in the last minute indeed, was to say this damages the narrative of war historically. Our extensions go deal with how we understand war in the current day, but very briefly on things like World War II or tombstones, we actually think it's easier to recognize the hardship that, like we did in the Vietnam War when we realized there were some heroes, but there were also bad things, rather than simply saying there was universally bad things, right? Americans tend, because of nationalism, which on both sides of the house exists, will find it very difficult to accept they did bad things. It's easier to sell it to them saying there were some heroes and some bad things. So we actually think it's better on our side. So, opening government. 2 points for rebuttal left. First of all, they said that this will make soldiers fear death less. I think that's just really bizarre. Why? Because soldiers are still people, right? They don't want to die. They want to go home. So, critically, I don't think soldiers think about the public perception of how they'd be thought of after they've died in combat, right? They're thinking usually about combat and avoiding being shot. Moreover, I actually think soldiers are actually irrelevant in this debate in terms of how they perceive themselves. Why? Because they have their own internal culture. Soldiers will still think of themselves with bonds of brotherhood that you've shared in basic training, and that you don't want to let your fellow soldier down. So I think soldiers' bonds are actually quite difficult for prop to get at in this debate, rather than simply saying they're not going to be heroes. The last thing opening government had was to say the sound criticism of the army. I don't think that's actually factually true insofar as we prosecuted the people who committed Abu Ghraib. Indeed, it's actually more likely we were going to prosecute them, because if you say that people died as heroes for a cause, you have undermined that cause by committing those atrocities. Therefore, you have undercut our heroes and their sacrifice. You actually make it easier for the American government to sanction soldiers and imprison them. So, first part of the extension, what's the impact on war? The top half of this debate focused on what wars are we going to go into, and there are two cases here which they've missed. The first case is like Iraq, where we invade states because it's perceived to be in the national interest. Bear in mind, most governments tend to do this in the face of popular opposition anyway. That's what happened with the British government and my government when we invaded Iraq, even though a million people protested in the street. The idea of soldiers being heroes after they've died isn't often a popular tombstone in that discussion, so it's likely to happen. The second and more important case where it is likely to have impact is humanitarian intervention. Why? Because people don't see the benefit of that. So if they're told that soldiers' deaths will be regrettable and not heroes for a cause, they're less likely to see the point behind that. That's incredibly damaging. But critically, we're going to go into wars on both sides of this debate. There's going to be some wars, I'm not sure how much, we can get a calculator out. The critical part of this debate and the next bit of our extension is what happens when we're in there, right? What's the problem here? Because when it's regrettable loss of life, we don't see the point of it. If they're dying as a hero, you create a stake in that conflict, and they are dying for a cause. That's the problem with the body bag factor. The more people die, the less likely to buy into that cause. The problem is that most populations do not see the long-term benefits of the conflict. They don't see bringing stability to Iraq, bringing democracy. Critically, though, when they die as heroes, we are reminded that there is a cause they are fighting for, rather than a regrettable loss of life that just happened. That implicitly brings it back, but also means they die for a purpose. That's incredibly important. Why? Because that increases our stomach for us to see the casualty figures piling up. This sounds unpalatable, but it's important. Why? It means we're less likely to pull out too early. That's incredibly important, either in case of humanitarian intervention, where it means we get the job done, or things like Iraq. If we hadn't perceived American soldiers who died as heroes, we would have pulled out far earlier. That would have been catastrophically terrible, because it led to a power vacuum and has led to the rise of ISIS, right? That would have been worse on your side. So, even on both sides of the debate, we enter into wars that are bad. The point is, once we're in there, we should analyse those who die in that conflict in order to preserve as much support for that conflict. Notice that doesn't create a whitewash of the conflict. There's still people who reject it. It's trying to balance those two things out so we don't withdraw too early. I'll take opening.
No, this is a timeline problem, right? So no one says, oh, we should intervene because if people died, they would be heroes. Rather, every time a soldier dies and they're treated their deaths as heroic and so on, it feeds the body bag effect, and it means that the calculus in which the democratic populations decide to support or not interventions becomes less rational, less based on civilian casualties.
But populations don't think like that, Duncan, right? Like, you actually make body bag effects worse on your side because they are regrettable losses of life rather than heroes who died for a cause, right? Populations are not rational. We are emotional people, and we have to have a stake in that conflict that they died for something. Like, heroism isn't just valorization, that they are a hero because of something and they have died for that cause. So, last plank of the extension. Who are soldiers? Opening government correctly points out they tend to be poor men, overwhelmingly and disproportionately not white. They said they were coerced into the army by the representation of that they would be heroes if they died. I don't think that's true insofar as most people don't expect to die, right? And if that's true, and if it wasn't mostly money that coerced them, you would get middle-class people into the army, not overwhelmingly poor people. That means that it's overwhelmingly money, not the narrative of heroism that coerces people into the army. They also know the risks through things like basic training and TV. So both sides of this debate, they are poor. But if they are poor, they have systematically little access to political capital. Duncan said, well, that stays the same. No, it doesn't, right? The idea of heroism buys us an idea that they died for a sacrifice. That's important. But critically, if they die for heroes, it means people are willing to listen to their political lobbying. Importantly, the opposition talks about after the fact veteran care. The more important thing is the public perception of the groups who did the fighting. One of the best things for African American rights after World War II was the fact that black Americans could also be heroes as well. Opening government said, no, heroism is masculine. No, heroism is not masculine. Women can be heroes too. LGBT can be heroes too. African Americans can be heroes too. The fact they are heroes in St. Louis are also white Americans cuts across all those divides. It creates a common bond of sympathy. Well, that means when they come back from the war, they're better, easier to demand political rights. That's what happened after World War II in the United States. Critically, that's so important because they tend to have very little of their own political capital, which is why they're in the army in the first place. Look, this probably doesn't have a massive impact on what wars we go into. It means when we do go into wars, we're more likely to pull out early and lead to mass death, and it means we treat the people who are compelled to fight into the army much worse. We're very proud to oppose.
We thank the Speaker for their speech and are delighted to call upon the Government Whip to conclude the case for side proposition.
Okay. First things first, it's an immense honor to be here. Secondly, CEO's case is a bit weird. Let's start with some rebuttal to what we've just said. So regarding humanitarian intervention, we actually have no idea how glorifying the dead, how emphasizing every casket that comes home, how showing continuously the fact that we have more and more soldiers that have died during wartime is something which creates more political power rather than less political power for future interventions, right? Because at the end of the day, what is going to happen is that we see that many people have died in the battlefield. If you put too much emphasis on the casket, this is what have caused some of the reasons that have caused others to pull out in the first place. But moreover, why you cannot use many other alternatives? The fact that the Yazidis were slaughtered was enough in order to gain the political capital in order to re-intervene in Iraq right now. We have no idea why we need specifically that mechanism. Thirdly, as said, note, we can also glorify soldiers right now. I know that they have blamed some contradictions. I'm going to sort it out later in the speech. No, not right now. Regarding the idea of soldiers that are right now being poor. Yet again, we are for honoring to an extent, and moreover, many African Americans have returned from the war. The fact that they have felt they are capable in order to do something, because they have felt themselves that because they have defended their nation, now they have more of a place in order to gain the confidence and run to the public sphere, is something which is let alone enough for them to be a part of society. We have no idea, A, what is the most, why it's actually that important in the debate, and B, why on principle it is something that we are willing to do, and C, why you cannot get it in many other ways. Then regarding to the answers to our extension, right, the idea of POWs, note, they miss the crucial nuance in our analysis. Because what we say is that not that soldiers or statehood do not have an agency, but what we say is that after their death, they return to the state of being non-combatants, which means that they return to the state in which the state itself cannot use them in order to actually promote other things. This is exactly the logic of being a POW. Once you've fallen out of war, once you're no longer a combatant, you cannot be used for your function, but rather you return to be a human being. Then they say, yes, but how can you say that someone have actually lived as a hero and not mentioned how he died? What we say is that if I was a hero and what you want to emphasize is my life throughout the entire time, you can do that, not the death itself. You cannot use me after I have died, right? I return to what I was beforehand as a human being and not as something that can be used in order to actually inspire others, etc., etc. Note another thing. They say, CEO says that soldiers do not have agency, COO says that they do, which is a contradiction there. Moreover, like the idea that I'm a hero before my death, you can tell my family that I've died as a hero. Just do not use it in order to inspire others. You can actually emphasize the living right now. Do not do it to inspire others. Where does this impact actually sit in this debate? Because Duncan starts and says by saying that this is not a debate about masculinity and patriotism because we have 4th of July, I'm quoting, we have Memory Day in order to honor some people. What this debate about is glorification, right? They talk about, it talks about PTSD money. We're more likely to actually get it if we're telling them that a lot of people have actually died horrible deaths, deaths that should have been prevented, and deaths that actually return them to a state of agency, saying that these are not people that just automatically should be heroes, that not all soldiers that go to war need some sort of a treatment. It's more likely on our side of the house. Moreover, right, I'm going to be a really direct Israeli here. Note, if a culture already exists, which prioritizes heroism already, because we already have 4th of July, if glorification of bravery already exists, the crucial thing here is the impact in the term of the principle. They blame us for contradicting OG. But when Duncan says himself that we already have 4th of July, that we already have Memorial Day, these are things that they accept on OG as well that are already part of the culture, which means that we already glorify the idea of bravery in our culture. However, we should not do it in order to use the dead themselves, because they do it specifically in their speeches, is something that we are willing to live with. Opening.
We explained that heroising dead soldiers is necessary to balance the overwhelming public views of war and what we should do with our army. What's your response?
So what we say is that if you overemphasize the dead, A, you are less likely to get the interventions that you want on your side. B, this is something which is on principle we're not willing to accept. Why? Because you already emphasize heroism to an extent in culture. However, what we tell you is that solidarity, if that's a word, is actually a function. However, humanity is a meaning, is a purpose of the human being. You're out of combat, you are no longer a soldier. Exactly like the idea that everything bad that you have done in your past does not longer sustain after you have left combat. Everything good that you have done should not be used as well in order to prioritize other aims but yourself. And this is a crucial thing in this debate, right? It is not about, this is idea of returning to the core of humanity, that you have had, but rather not to the functionality. You need to remember me as the agent that I was, not as a function that was used in order to save other people. You should not glorify that part. You just regret that I am dead and feel sad for it. Closing.
The problem is it's not the state that heroizes them, it's the public reaction. So it's not the state corrupting them as a soldier after death, it's a public recognition of the heroism that they've done, which means we remember the war.
No, it is the state once we have commemoration days. It is the state once we have memorials. It is the state once we use them in order to say that they are heroes in public schools as part of our education. We do not agree that it's the public solely that does that. This is simply wrong. What we give you is because many of the effects actually on the living already exist by OG's own analysis in the status quo. The main core issue here is the principle that they cannot be used in order to inspire others. They cannot be used specifically after their death. Only the living that are still soldiers can be glorified, not the dead. But why specifically? Why specifically we also say that this is bad? Note, in many places there are endless post-conflict society. The fact that we constantly glorify the ones who died actually shackles the progression of the society. We can see that in places like the Balkans, in which if you continuously do things as commemorate everyone that have died in a war that was 20 years ago, you're constantly telling the diaspora of the people that live in these countries that you are the villain rather than other people, that you cannot unturn these shackles. You're constantly telling these places. Moreover, in here specifically, in this very place, you had the idea of Stunde Null, which is the 0 hour. The idea that after World War II, you just need to erase everything that have happened in order for the society to progress. The fact that you're constantly going to concentrate on past grievances, the fact that you're constantly going to do this rather than to try and to have a new impact and to shape a new narrative is something which is going to cause, this is what explains what causes less of a progression of society, which is not fair for other minorities that constantly live there and portray them as the villains, and something which is not fair because we cannot just use cynically the dead soldiers. Please propose.
We thank the speaker very much. And to conclude the case for the closing opposition, the opposition side, this debate, and the debates in this tournament, I am delighted to call upon the opposition whip.
Sorry. In Whip Today, I want to remind everyone what this debate is, what is at stake, what actually matters in terms of social messaging, in terms of sacrifice, in terms of recognition, and what is status quo. What is the debate? It is not that currently every single death is glorified, and we wish to prevent that. The status quo is a majority of soldiers' deaths are seen as regrettable, and a few who have gone above and beyond the call of duty are venerated within the media and on front pages as heroes. Now, obviously, there is some degree of you are all making a sacrifice, and that is all significant, but the debate is specifically about those who get the frontline headlines, who get the main veneration. They get medals in Buckingham Palace, they get handshakes with the president, or, if they are dead, have their families collect those honors on their behalf. We think this is particularly significant. Before we go any further, we want to remind people that soldiers will, as a nature of their profession, continue to do this anyway. Soldiers will always have a culture within their regiments and within their communities that will venerate heroism. This is true within PMCs. This is true within PMCs who currently have no state to recognize them. There's still a culture of fraternity. This is true within the police force, who are often criticized. This is true actually within lumberjacks, who have much higher death rates than soldiers, aren't often given big awards, but still recognize that there is a community they can value. Why is this important? Because what we are talking about is how society views soldiers, not how soldiers view themselves. This means that when we come to talk about some of the stuff that top half has contributed, we're not going to see any more or less foolish risks within warfare. We're not going to see big cognitive shifts on how soldiers conduct themselves on the battlefield. This is not something which this policy will affect. What this policy will affect is how we view soldiers, how we view them back home, and how we view the wars we are participating within. Now, we don't think that heroism is synonymous with stupidity, and we certainly do not think that heroism is gendered. If anything, heroism is a human experience, one that we think can transcend masculinity or race, is essentially a sacrificing love, something which we think deserves commemoration. Some points that have not been talked about yet in opening government. The erosion of democracy, the idea that Petraeus has a disproportionate voice. Well, no, we probably think that what Petraeus is trying to do is tell Obama, who has a political incentive to yank out of Iraq, that that would be a bad idea, and he spent a long time convincing Obama that maybe we should prolong this process. Petraeus is now probably feeling both sad and ultimately satisfied that everything he thought would go wrong went wrong as soon as America withdrew. We don't think this is disproportionate. We don't think this is a consequence of heroism. This is a consequence of military specificity. Secondly, that this perverts electoral viability. I mean, insofar as you live in Israel, somewhere which is much more likely to be in some kind of conflict, it is unclear to me about why valuing someone's military credentials is a perversion of electoral viability. If you are in America, where there is less of an emphasis, then clearly we have someone who is a war hero who lost an election. We have McCain, who is about as heroic as it gets. That did not help him pervert democracy. He was tortured. He sacrificed an enormous amount. People still value people based off their capacity to govern. So we don't think Top's criticisms on that particular front are very relevant. What we do think, though, is that we want to talk about this extension, because we think it has some assumptions made about what a state can or cannot do, and it's completely ignored the soldiers' agency when they want to shape some degree of narrative around their death. Now, the analysis we were given by second government in terms of their extension is that you cannot, as a state, appropriate someone after death to promote any kind of message that might benefit the state, or not even benefit the state, but distort discourse. Now, to a degree, this was by its nature assertive. In the extension, we had 3 minutes on why this is analogous to POWs. In the whip, we didn't hear anything about POWs. We think this is probably because POWs are not analogous. POWs often return to armies and then tried upon the standards of the army that they left. Clearly, death is distinct. So let's talk about death specifically. Let's talk about the highest burden that second government wants to set themselves. We do not see why it is illegitimate for a soldier liable to be commemorated as a hero, that is to say, liable to be recognized for throwing himself on a grenade, or in the case of the last Potsdamer's Victoria Cross given, driving an APC with his arm blown off, filled with his comrades to safety under heavy fire. We do not see why these people are liable to be reluctant to have their families cherished in the public eye, to have their legacy emphasized utilised by the government to have the sacrifice they made out of love, compassion for their state, and for the cause that they were fighting for being venerated. In fact, we think it is a greater perversion of that narrative to withdraw that right to have any discussion of their sacrifice and to have any commiseration given publicly to what they have done. We think they are much more likely to lean towards wishing to be commemorated. Specifically, we can see this because currently regiments put people forward for medals. They are the regulatory body that currently decides which people do get commemorated, and if they had some deep distaste for the state appropriating their identity in a way that commemorates their sacrifice, they would probably stop nominating people for a Victoria Cross or nominating people for the Legion of Honour. These are particular distinctions that mean it is more of a perversion to say that you have no right to have your heroic sacrifice discussed by a state than to say that all people should on some sense be just considered casualties of war. Your response?
Basically, what we say is very simple. You do not know when I am dead what my wishes may have been at my point of death. Therefore, it is illegitimate for you to inscribe me to this sort of
nation. That there is a negative to the claim you are making. That is to say that we do not know whether you want to be venerated or ignored. And to simply say that no one gets venerated is much more prescriptive than letting regiments self-select nominations for medals that allow people to be commemorated. Because if they had an intense distaste to have the loving sacrifice of a comrade discussed, they would probably not put them forward into the discourse. They would not nominate them for a medal. They would not push them to be commemorated and cherished. We do not think that this is an illegitimate action of a state. And insofar as it might be, we don't really think that that overcomes the positives it can bring to both the regiment and to the dialogue. And this dialogue is what we brought to you in extension and what hasn't been responded to. Let's talk about war specifically, because there has been generalizations. There are wars that are seen as reasons of state, which are pushed through against enormous public opposition. And there are wars that are interventions, which are often seen as humanitarian crises by the people being briefed, but are unpopular with the public. Why is this particularly pernicious on both? Because the wars that are reasons of state, see Iraq, go through even if there are 2.5 million people protesting outside Westminster. What you then have to discuss is how long you stay afterwards. And we think although these wars are harmful on both sides of the House, it is better to have some sustainable form of occupation to seek stability. Considering that that is conditional on your public buying into that occupation, and therefore conditional on caring about soldiers who are participating in such an occupation, hero narratives are going to do a lot more to fuel the interest in staying there and in looking after the situation than an ever-growing, unmentioned, undiscussed body count. And in terms of humanitarian intervention, we think that when France goes into Africa, goes into Mali, I think, and ultimately does its very best to intervene and participate, they are more likely to have that popular at home when you have heroes dying for a cause that the French people can then recognize as something worth fighting for, first of all because their soldiers are fighting for it, and secondly because they are dying for it. We think that what we get here is a veneration of individuals, and more importantly, one that transcends all the harms of more biased systems within society, that gives all the benefits that Rory brought you with regards to how people perceive the poorest and most vulnerable, which have not been responded to, and ultimately why heroism, as a merit, deserves commemoration, why it's more likely to be the wish of the dead soldier, and why we should support it.